was a historian. And so they were their own guardians of their own archives. And I think thinking about posterity, preparing to leave the house to the Emerson Foundation to become the museum as we know today, they also took care to leave all of the papers to the University of Rochester. And Seward and his family were savers. The attics were full of their things, and there were just trunks. To read the story of the discovery from the first generation of archivists and historians who realized what was up there, it was a eureka moment for them of joy. So they, just like they saved all the material things that visitors today can experience and enjoy at the museum, they saved all the paper things, receipts, but every letter, every scrap of paper, pocket diaries, real diaries, correspondence. Really the only thing missing in many cases are if Seward sent a letter to somebody else, that letter of course is in that archive. So we have one side of many correspondence, but if they were internal letters, sort of family to family, they usually made their way back home at the end of the day. So there's a lot of complete closed conversations happening.
It's probably the closest thing to a 360 view of someone from that time.
You really couldn't ask for much more, except for maybe being able to bring them back for a conversation like this one. Any possible source they could left behind, they did.
You know, I used to take tours. I'd climb onto buses or I'd arrange for tours. And of course the Seward House was always a part of it. And the thing that I remember from it most vividly was walking out, particularly tours from people from New York or Toronto, some large city. They'd be walking out shaking their heads saying, I've never seen anything like this. And I have to tell local people this because they don't seem to know it. It's this perfect storm that I didn't expect. I'm from the West Coast, so I didn't know what I was going to see. Typically, the house is, some period piece has been stripped by a family. When the family left, the person, maybe they're a group, a volunteer group, was able to pull together not just period pieces, but maybe some original things, and then there'd be kind of a show and tell. It wouldn't be vivid enough, and most of them I wasn't that interested in. This one has everything, and you have to add the Emerson Foundation. The fact that the Emerson Foundation, the largest foundation in Central New York, happens to be here at the time when the last Seward family member leaves, turns it over to them, and they support it. In other words, it didn't get stripped. Yep. Everything is in it. They kept all the records. This guy was at the pinnacle. He was at the pinnacle of a period of American political as well, social history as well. And now we're going to get into, women's rights. Really, absolutely fantastic. I have to, it blew me away when I saw this. And all I can say is, that anybody who visited this place from outside that was accustomed to going to houses like the Seward House, and just shaking their head saying they've never seen anything like it.
You're right. If you're not blown away, you don't really know what you're looking at. It is such a rarity to find an integrity of collection like the Seward House Museum with about 99.9% original. It really should blow you away. It blew me away. I think you're quite right. Usually you go to a house museum and you expect there to be the inverse ratio. Yeah. You'll walk into a room and you'll see the one or two things that were original to the historic owners, and then the rest is designed to be a facsimile. And in our case, there's one thing in the room, usually a floor, wall, or window treatment that, for whatever reason, didn't make it. So it provides a great backdrop for really exceptional storytelling. It's a perfect confluence of the fact that the family saved things, like, as you say, on the cusp of so many pivotal debates and moments driving U.S. history. William Seward, but really the whole family, and their whole world comes to life in the house. That the Emerson Foundation was in place at the right time to step in and deliver it to this public. And I know that the community does support it and get it, but you're right. It takes something like seeing somebody come in who wouldn't know all on a map before they got here to see this, and they get, you have this? Their excitement becomes infectious, and it reminds me again, importantly, to appreciate and not take for granted. So
somewhere in there is a vial. I'm remembering from 35 years ago, about this big, with a little bit of tea from the Boston Tea Party. Have you seen that?
It's on the dining room table right now on display.
Is it? Where do you go to find tea from the Boston Tea Party?
That's another thing. Seward was just given unbelievable objects as gifts, tokens of the esteem of nations and his own countrymen. Mm-hmm. There were no ethics laws back then about accepting gifts, whether one was in office or not. He was not shy about saying yes to any time he was offered anything. And so the house is a treasure trove of international pieces and American history. There's the vial of Boston tea leaves, and of course there's the desk from the very first U.S. Congress. It was in the room for George Washington's inauguration. It could have been James Madison's desk.
Bloody sheet and his.
The bloody sheet.
The bed on which he died.
Yeah, right.
I mean, that's
The so-called death couch.
right. I mean, that's literally his entire life is in that house, every stage of it.
And if you can believe it, the house he was born as a boy still stands in Florida. Like, what figure born in 1801, boyhood and adult home, are still standing, and you can visit both?
That's interesting. So tell us about Frances. There's something important about her, right?
Right, she is really, you could do, and we do, entire house tours built around her. And you really, I think the museum does a good job of making sure you're not just leaving having been served up sort of great white man of history, William Seward.
This is new, by the way. You have anything to do with this?
Well, I think it's an increasing realization, not only of the importance of Frances Seward, his wife, Fanny Seward, his daughter, the importance of strong women like his William Seward's sister-in-law, or Frances's elder sister, Lizette, who grows up in the house on South Street, folding in stories like Harriet Tubman, the friend and neighbor from down the street, Margaret Stewart, the young woman who spent the Civil War years in the house, that they weren't just there, they weren't just window dressing. We know that for a fact that Frances, especially through Seward's more radical political period, when he is leading the charge as an anti-slavery statesman for the Whig Republican parties, she's proofing his speeches. He's practicing for her. They have an incredibly open, and I mean open in terms of equitable marriage, in which she's invited and expected to weigh in because he respects her mind and knows in some ways she's better informed and better read than he is on issues he wants to talk about. So she has right to cross things off, and he almost always accepts editorial changes and substantive changes. So there's an intellectual partnership that animates it. It's not perfect. There were gender imbalances then as now, worse then than now. He could override her as he became more ambitious for the presidency. He tended to drown out her advice more because she was a radical soul, much more of an abolitionist, and he needed to win. So needed to bring moderates to his side of things. We're getting ahead of ourselves in the story, but just to give you some insight, those stories are pivotal to understanding Seward, and they're not just background stories, they're foreground stories.
The relationship of the women in the agitators, I don't know how much we want to get into this, but what I really liked about with Dorothy Wickington's book is the relationships. She talks about the relationships of those three women, plus Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others. Can you describe something of what you're seeing from inside the Seward House of the relationship between those three women?
Yes, I think Dorothy does an amazing job of weaving them together because the sources didn't lead her there naturally. It's so easy to see them apart because they're living separate lives in so many ways. Frances much more publicly than Martha or Harriet Tubman. Tubman in the last 50 years has finally come into her own and is receiving the due that she deserves as the Moses of her people, as she was called, as this leader of so many daring rescues, 13 on the Underground Railroad. And Martha was sort of seen somewhat in between. She was pegged more the kid sister of Lucretia Mott, who was also there for Seneca Falls and would find her voice. So she was sort of tied to the stories of women's rights, Tubman to abolition of Underground Railroad, Frances to her husband's political legacy. But between the lines, they were keeping company.
Yes.
It's easy to imagine them all in the same place at the same time, having conversations that don't always make it into the historical record. I think Dorothy had to do some real sleuthing. For as good as the paper trail is we were talking about, you are not going to go to Rochester and dig up the Seward papers, or go, I think they're at Smith College, where are they, the Wright papers, or the Osborne papers in Syracuse, and find that sort of smoking gun document. Here's what we talked about. So you have to really piece things together. One of the things that we know they're doing in the 1850s is they're having simultaneous conversations. These sometimes were wedge issues. Reformers trying to decide which issues of equality would be front and center in their agitation. Is it women's rights? Is it anti-slavery? Is it racial justice? Is it gender equality? Can you have both at the same time? This was the fissure between Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony. And for for Frances and her sister, they often were forced to choose where to put their money, to put their energies. At first, we're coming down on we need to end slavery first. This is the principal evil of our time, and then we'll come back to right things for women. But these were happening concurrently and overlapping. Abolitionists and suffragists were almost always keeping company, trying to do both things at once. So that's sort of the dovetailing sort of animus that brought the three of them together, a shared conviction that slavery was evil and wrong. Frances and Martha opening their homes up as a stop on the Underground Railroad, being friends and allies to Harriet Tubman, who they came to know over the course of the long 1850s, the time when she's making all these journeys, making it known to her that there'd be safe haven here for her in 1859, when she purchases a 7-acre farm just down the street from where we are right now, exactly 100 down at 188. We're here at 88 South Street. And Tubman doesn't get the recognition she deserves, neither does Frances, but both were also agitators for women's rights. We know Harriet Tubman, after the war, turns her energies to, of course, caring for people and her farm, building a home for the aged, taking on issues of racial injustice, but also working for women's equality. There's a picture of her at the same rally as Susan B. Anthony. And though Frances Seward does not live long after the war, she is weighing and is drawing distant from her husband, coming closer and closer to believing that suffrage was the next battle she wanted to fight. And Martha is sort of in between, on the front lines of both of those movements.
There was, in that book, I'm gonna forget the name if I don't see it here. In the book is the racist in, Michigan? Maybe I better just look this up. I'll get cut out of this, but let me see. I was just fascinated with this. Oh, Kansas.
Oh, Bleeding Kansas?
The 1867, the argument between Stanton and Anthony, Kansas had these two constitutional changes to deal with: abolition, the women's vote, and the vote of blacks.
Right.
And you had Anthony and Stanton coming in and jumping on one side at the expense of the other, and working on a publication with a fellow named George Francis Train, a racist, who subsidized the publication. They were overlooking this guy's racism and actually were an apologist for them. This is by 1870 they were doing this, and Martha Wright and Lucretia Mott were backing away from this. In fact, I think they both quit. There was the American Rights Association, the American, what was it called? Equal Rights Association. They backed away over that. I thought that was very interesting. There was a difference between these women and a backing away from their relationships.
Right. The movement was big enough to hold a lot of fellow travelers, from ultras, as they would have been called,
Yeah.
to maybe more moderate, really close to what Frances and Lizette, the Millers, Frances Seward, were up through the Civil War, because they weren't single issue. There was women's rights and anti-slavery, but with the settling of the latter, the 13th Amendment, the ending of the Civil War, Reconstruction opens up a whole number of new debates. So it's no longer about anti-slavery; it's about civil rights, and the 14th and 15th Amendment. If you can't have civil rights and voting rights for people of color and women, who goes first? Because you have to, if you're forced to choose which battle to fight, and that was a fault line that saps a lot of the momentum. It's not for nothing that Frederick Douglass is at Seneca Falls. There are a lot of overlapping sympathies, and the movement, big enough to take on both these at once. And then one crisis sort of solved, a new one opens, and then these difficult choices about where to. That's sort of the big thing for all of these agitators. There's so many wrongs you could right, and you have one lifetime to give to it.
Today.
So which wrongs do you choose to dedicate all of your energies into? And I think that's what makes it so interesting, and what Dorothy does in The Agitators is they were trying to have it both ways. They were trying to be, we can do both. We can have our cake and eat it too. We can bring a greater standard of equality for women. We can end slavery, And then what comes next is, of course, and then we have to bring a new equalitarianism to all the races.
Notice that the position of single-minded position on women's rights was a self-interested position. And when Martha and Lucretia Mott backed away from that, they were not taking the self-interested position, which was women's rights. They were taking the larger position that who needs this more? They're getting lynched, although that hadn't quite begun there, but they're basically turning back to slavery in the South. In other words, you have to have the rights to vote, more serious with the blacks than with women. I think there was a division there. But I mean, maybe it comes down to this question. Maybe you can address this thing. I don't think the rights of a woman or the rights of a black person to vote was on the same level as the rights to equality. It's not the same thing. A person could denounce slavery,
Right.
but still not consider a person of color an equal.
Yes, and that's absolutely who William Seward. That fits him to a T.
That's what I yeah.
Exactly. Like,
And Francis.
and Francis. I was also just thinking, I want to come back to your question, that one of the things that I think makes examining the Seward marriage so interesting is there's a tension going on between William and Francis throughout their 41 years together, which is that Seward is constantly seeking offices and sometimes has to be pragmatic and compromise and negotiate and settle for half rather than all, and live in shades of gray. And Francis can afford to be the ideological purist and the radical who doesn't have to compromise and can come at her husband hard when he does, and often she does that. She's not trying to win elections, she's trying to win the moral argument. So there's a pragmatism that he has that she doesn't have. But I think you're right, and there's a difference between thinking generally about equalitarian idealism and then legislative victories, accomplishments, and actionable victories, winning the end of slavery or voting rights. And thinking about Francis also, one of the key arguments she came up against, I think, speaks to your point. So before she even meets Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott and gets really more activated into women's rights, earlier in the 1830s, William Seward becomes governor. He's elected in 1838. It's the middle of about a 12 or a 14-year run in which the property rights bill in New York is being debated. It was being debated before Seward becomes governor. It's still on the floor after he leaves.
Property rights
bill for women.
Right.
Which would have given women in marriage the right to hang on to all that they brought in, their basically agency, some legal, not full, but some legal autonomy,
Yeah.
collect rents and enter into contracts and eventually divorce. And many of the critics said, this is a gateway, this is a slippery slope into, they're going to want the vote next and they're going to be treated equals of men.
We
So
can't have this.
for many, even things that weren't like absolute equalitarianism's golden standards of now everything's perfect, kumbaya, we've achieved this utopia of pure equality, that these steps forward, these steps towards progress were leading towards that happening. And critics of property rights or suffrage or the anti-slavery movement or civil rights bills certainly saw it in those terms.
I think did you want to say something?
I did a quick follow-up question.
Please do.
Considering the role that Francis had in William's life and his world, if you take her out, would he have gone as far as he did?
Good question.
In politics?
That is a good question. I think he would have lost a lot of his eloquence. The speeches wouldn't have been as good. We tend at the Seward House to call Francis her husband's moral compass. To usually tell him what was right, even if he didn't always do it, even if he had to deviate and settle for half, not all.
Right, keep him grounded.
And he had campaign managers like Thurlow Weed who were sort of the other. He was often the devil on the one shoulder saying, do this and you'll win, and Francis was the angel on the other saying, do this because it's right. And then he was sort of ping-ponging between both. But to the opposite point of that, while she does, I think, give him that moral grounding and speaks truth to him in a way that few others did, and spoke to him in religious terms. So she's Quaker background, Emma Willard's school, and her father raises her in this Quaker upbringing, like so many ladies at Seneca Falls. she can push her husband along spiritual lines and moral lines, and often and does that. But in 1859, he's hoping to become president in the next election, take the Republican nomination. His campaign managers who say what you need to do to win is to go to Europe, you're too radical, you're too hot, let's get you away from statements like your irrepressible conflict speech you just gave in Rochester and cool down a bit. She says, she advises him not to do that. There's an argument you can make, and we sort of make it on tour, that if he had listened to his wife in this one critical moment on the eve of the presidency, he probably, not Lincoln, would have won. He would have been visible. There's no way of really knowing that, playing counterfactual, but it's a fun thing to think about. In some sense, if he listened to her, he might very well have been president, and not Lincoln.
Yeah, that's, you know, my work on Thomas More Osborne, he was also an idealist and could never settle for reality. And he was close, you know, he and Franklin Roosevelt were much alike, about the same level of society, but good-looking, tall, good-looking men. Franklin Roosevelt would compromise, becomes president, becomes governor, becomes president. Osborne would not compromise, doesn't achieve any significant position. I mean, I saw that throughout the book, and I hear it in what you're saying here. She was keeping him from, you could imagine he would be focused on just success alone without having that moral compass. I think it's very interesting.
I think, speaking to that point, what happens in the very brief period in Seward's career when he loses her? So we know she dies about 2.5 months after Abraham Lincoln is killed. Seward's nearly killed that same night. His family comes under attack in Washington as part of that conspiracy. An accomplice of John Wilkes Booth attacks the family, nearly kills Seward. Frances actually dies of what her doctors called shocks, probably a stroke. And so she dies in June of 1865. So Seward becomes a widower. He still is in power for 3.5 years. And what do you see him do? He buys Alaska. He becomes famous for that. Manifest destiny. He becomes an expansionist. He tries for other territorial land grabs. But what you don't see anymore is him stepping up to the plate during this time of radical republicanism, when there are all sorts of debate about what do we do with the freedmen and the freedwomen. We have the Freedmen's Bureau. We have Republicans really pushing the Johnson White House hard to make sure there will be no black codes, that there will be a measure of equality. There's this moment where bold experimentation is possible, and Seward isn't there. The party.
He's still Secretary of State.
He's still Secretary of State.
That's interesting. I never thought of that.
Under Lincoln, even though Secretary of State should be doing foreign policy, he's weighing in on domestic matters, but he's kind of steering clear of that under Johnson. And some critics say, rightly, the Seward of higher laws and irrepressible conflicts, of stirring oratory. I mean, at times he does advocate for a vision, at least, of some racial equality in the Freeman trial of 1846. That Seward is gone. He's sometimes wrongly attributed with quotes disparaging freedmen and freedwomen, saying he no longer cares. The issue was slavery, not race, and he's not is invested in advocating now for the greater equality or inclusion of African Americans, whether they were free in the North or newly freed in the South. There are others who say that Seward was working quietly. He didn't want to agitate Johnson to advance the 14th Amendment, that he was secretly, clandestinely working with Thaddeus Stevens and other radicals, but there's not a lot of substance to that. And where I think Seward is sort of weakest in terms of our 21st century wishes and expectations for who he might have been is in this Reconstruction period, where he could have been an important voice in the administration, like Edmund Stanton, trying to really protect the newly freed and the enfranchised in theory with the amendment, and he's not there. And Frances is not there either, and maybe there's something about her absence explaining, in part, I don't want to say a failure, but a diminishing of his once soaring rhetoric and advocacy.
Makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense.
The relationship between Seward and Lincoln is pretty well documented. What was the relationship like between Seward and Johnson?
Well, Seward was. People were often confronted. Why was he? Many thought he should leave. He should leave the administration. Most didn't. I mean, Edwin Stanton, who was much more radical than Seward, and really the strongest voice of protection for freedmen and freedwomen, the Secretary of War, who Johnson gets impeached trying to remove from office. Seward never grew to love Johnson the way he had grown to love Lincoln. Johnson was less formidable. He gave Seward a lot more latitude to kind of run the State Department like he wanted to. There was an opportunism to Seward. He's a peacetime secretary now. All the inroads he had made in Europe, keeping them out of the war. He had this window of opportunity, he thought, to really leave his name on the history books. No longer any danger that any new lands acquired would ever be subject to the old debates. Will these new territories enter free and slave? So he's consumed with trying to acquire places like Alaska and many others. So he can really operate with a lot of impunity under Johnson. He gives a couple speeches in Auburn talking about reconciliation and healing. He's flattering to Johnson. The historical record is really kind of mixed. Some think he was playing Johnson the way he thought wrongly. He was going to play Lincoln, be a little bit two-faced, deferential to his face, and do what he wanted behind his back. And Lincoln, he tried that with Lincoln, and it did not work. And with Johnson, perhaps that was the case. This is a chapter of Seward's career that is peculiar. It's unflattering, and even up to the time Johnson's impeached, Seward is trying to work and win votes against the impeachment. So Johnson deserved to be impeached, and Seward is working hard to keep Johnson in power.
If Seward and Johnson weren't necessarily friendly with each other, is there evidence of any kind of mutual respect that the two may have had for one another?
You know, that's a great question too. And the kind of people, the people to whom Seward would most likely have revealed his true thoughts to had died by the time
His confidant.
His wife and his daughter, Fanny, are both gone. He doesn't keep a diary the way that Fanny does. All the public comments are warm, and I would love to go back now and read some of the biographers' takes on it, but most of them, I think, argue, as I'm arguing now, it was a marriage of convenience and not a passion, the way the one with the relationship with Lincoln had been.
Right.
And what was he going to do? Seward had hoped that when the election of 1868 came along, that Grant, who'd been thrown right into the middle of the impeachment controversy, was going to become president, might ask him to stay on. Some even thought Seward might run for president in 1868. He's too injured, a little old for that. But there's a sense that he had hoped that Grant might ask him to stay on, and he could be recapturing some of the old Lincoln magic, but now under peacetime circumstances. So a popular president, a powerful president, unlike Johnson, under whom the biggest thing Seward faced trying to get things done under Johnson was that Congress wouldn't work with him. Nobody wanted to give the White House any victories. They were continuously passing legislation against Johnson's vetoes. But if Grant was in the White House, and it was presumed he would be a great president, it turns out there were all sorts of problems. He trusted the wrong people. But Seward thought that with someone like Grant in the White House, all the things he dreamed of doing under Johnson, maybe adding British Columbia and parts of Canada and into Mexico and Panama and Cuba, all these new free territories and eventually states, would just fall right into line. Grant had no interest in that kind of expansionism, nor in keeping Seward.
If Frances had lived, what do you think would have been the advice she would have given him? To either stay with Johnson
That's a good question.
or venture out and do your own thing?
That is a good question. I think we know from Frances's letters she was the toughest on her husband when she saw him bending and wavering, compromising with slavery. I'd like to think it would have been the same thing with the rights of freedmen and freedwomen. So the 14th and 15th Amendment, I think she would have pushed him really hard to be there. That she would not have let him just go quiet on those subjects. It would not be, he couldn't just go home, a bachelor widower, with his cigars and brandy, look at a globe and think, yes, this is me now. She would have, I think, pressed him harder to keep some of the promise, some of the ideals they shared since they were kids, really. And they meet with their children. They meet when she would have been about 16, 17, and he about 19, 20, 21. And one of the first things she knows about Seward, he's just graduated from Union College. He gave the commencement address. He condemned slavery in it. These were supposed to be lifelong shared precepts.
So one of the questions here is,
Yeah.
he was Secretary of State, and yet I remember which Secretary of State, their portfolio was outside the United States, and yet we remember him as a anti-slavery person. How did that work in the Lincoln administration? And then we follow on to Johnson, and now he moves into the Johnson administration, he's still got the same portfolio.
Right.
Does he lose whatever de facto arrangement or influence he had as a Secretary of State within the country?
Good questions all. So Seward his reputation leading up to the 1860 election is built largely on his anti-slavery legacy, principles, rhetoric, oratory. That doesn't disappear when he becomes Secretary of State, when Lincoln defeats him. Both men are on the record up to the election, and Seward actually campaigns well for Lincoln that fall as being opponents to slavery. Seward more so than Lincoln. Both agree that slavery should not be allowed to extend any further into the Western territories. Lincoln becomes president. The 7 southern states secede from Union. They don't believe he's that much more moderate than Seward, afraid the future of slavery hangs in the balance, and so not waiting for the new administration. So Seward does something interesting. He actually, trying to keep a brokered peace before Lincoln's inauguration day in March 1861, is having these back-channel conversations with Southerners about maybe building a 13th Amendment into the Constitution, guaranteeing the right of slavery to exist in its current location in perpetuity. Yeah, it would have been a 13th Amendment guaranteeing, not ending slavery, but no compromise can be reached. Seward continues to have anti-slavery belief, and Frances excoriates him for even having those conversations. She writes him a letter that compromise like that, while 4 million people remain in chains, cannot be right. And she warns him that if he makes a compromise like this, he's going to become the next Daniel Webster, this northerner of shame who sold his soul. And for what? During the Lincoln administration, even though he's supposed to be, and is, I think most historians would say, the thing that Seward should best be remembered for, and isn't Alaska, nor maybe Underground Railroad and Harriet Tubman. It's keeping Europe out of the war, affecting the global neutrality, isolating the Confederacy. At the same time, Lincoln and he become close friends and confidants. Lincoln invites him in to so many meetings where he really has no business being there. The famous picture that I know everyone's seen in this room of the Francis Carpenter first reading of the Emancipation Proclamation from July of 1862 shows Lincoln and Seward at a crowded table, papers strewn everywhere. Seward's got them, the focus in the room actually seems to be on Seward. We know that both men work on this document, this draft together. In fact, we had on display an original copy of that with both hands. So there's an argument to be made that Seward is still affecting anti-slavery policies and helping to shape that document. As Secretary, he'll ratify the 13th Amendment. So in a way, realizing a 40-year dream of ending slavery with a pen stroke. So those aren't the tasks put on him by Lincoln during the Civil War, but he knows, as much as he and Lincoln might say in 1861 and 1862, this is a war for Union, that it's obviously a war for slavery, and the Emancipation Proclamation makes that perfectly plain. And Seward's an architect of that document, which really changes the war from one about Union to one openly now about slavery, which is also a shot across the bow at Europe. If England or France come sailing in now, they're sailing into a war that is on its face all about slavery, which they've condemned in their own lands.
Right, that's very good. So Johnson, now Lincoln's assassinated, Johnson's now president. You know, Seward has the same portfolio.
Yeah.
But those back channels or that relationship would be a fundamentally different thing. He would lose all that influence right there.
And it's like we talked about with what happens after the war, all this sort of radicalism that's got under a big umbrella and it kind of scatters to the winds. So many anti-slavery and abolitionist reformers had to figure out who they were when slavery is abolished. And not all of them fit naturally into civil rights warriors and champions. Some of them think, okay, well, we do what we set out to do.
God has told me to free the slaves, that's done, let's get on with it.
Right, and what happens next isn't my problem.
Yeah.
And then I think that was kind of Seward's approach, that he had done what he had set out to do, and he had never really wrapped his mind around or advocated for.
Frances would not allow that.
She would not have, no. And so Seward never had any of the misguided notions of even someone like Lincoln, that that racial harmony was impossible, and that there should be some sort of recolonization effort. Lincoln supports a recolonization effort, thinking freed slaves should be sent back to Africa. Seward knows that's nonsense. It's all Americans. I would like to think that somewhere deep down, Seward never lost the really moving closing arguments he makes in the Freeman defense, that freemen, all people of color, were made in the same maker as everybody else, and they should be held to the same standard of humanity, even if he's not saying that as well anymore.
Right.
That's probably me being wishful, but that's still there, even if Seward's mind has wandered and Francis is not there to bring it back.
Well, it's one thing to believe it, it's another thing to be an activist.
Yeah,
And the point is, he stopped being an activist.
he did.
Dude, can I ask you a question? I'm curious. There are stories that say that the South had a very aggressive attitude, that slavery was really the thing, and that states' rights was just the piece that made it work, and that they had a plan once they won to take over Mexico, to claim the entire western part of the country, and to turn the lower class citizens of Mexico into slaves, and to keep slavery going, even though slavery was not a good economic plan if you look at it from a business standpoint. Was that discussed at the dinner table with Fanny or with Francis? Did Francis understand that might have been a very aggressive move, and for all the more reasons her husband needed to be involved?
That's a good question. They both support the Wilmot Proviso in 1846. So any lands that were won in the Mexican-American War should be free lands. Let's get that on the table right now. Let's make this war not one about growing the slave empire. I don't know. I know in Seward's mind, Mexico is important. He actually, very late in his life, thinks like basically all of North America is going to become the United States at one point, and the balance of power will swing down almost to Mexico. So it's constantly on their mind. Francis, Quaker, pacifist, is very much opposed to her son. Her oldest son, Augustus, goes to West Point, graduates just in time to go down and fight in the Mexican-American War. She hates that for that reason. She hates it because she thinks it's going to become a slave empire. Interestingly, it's not quite answering your question, Jim, but interestingly, when the Civil War is imminent, Frances she loses a little bit of that objection to all war, and she actually writes to her sister, the glorious time is rolling on. She's ready to bring this war on. Whether she had a hard opinion about Mexico, I don't know much more beyond that.
No, nothing in writing. No writings.
Not that I've seen.
I see.
I didn't see in Dorothy's book, I didn't see Frances sounding warlike. I did see her backing away from the Quaker principles of pacifism, but I still didn't, it didn't sound like, well, I mean, you had her sister, her older sister, Lucretia Mott, saying, let's just let them go. We don't need to fight this war, just let them succeed. That'd be a very different world, wouldn't it?
It would indeed.
So
Martha, I don't know as much. I know there's the letter. I'm thinking of one letter that Frances writes to her sister Lizette, in which she sort of, I think, is seemingly welcoming the war on by talking about the glorious time rolling on. And at this point, she's had it. It's the 1850s were a decade that was tough, and it seemed like the South kept winning every fight. The Fugitive Slave Act, popular sovereignty in Bleeding Kansas, the caning of Charles Sumner, Roger Taney's Supreme Court, the Dred Scott decision.
yeah.
So, Frances by this point has completely given in to, she's breaking the law, opening her home up after the Jerry rescue in Syracuse in 1851, and she's really the one responsible for harboring passengers on the Underground Railroad.
Did Jerry come here? Did Jerry go to?
But no, Skinny Atlas, I think, was as far as he got close to here, before getting north. But Frances, that sort of her wake-up moment, that she writes to her husband about that, and it's not long after that she decides, because of the property rights bill, the house that she grew up in, her father's house, passes to her when he dies in 1851, not William Seward. So that same year of the Jerry rescue, her father dies, the house becomes hers, and lo and behold, it's not long after that she opens it up to be a station on the Underground Railroad.
Okay. But she's not a problem. She's not against violating that kind of law.
Right. So you can see her bending and breaking rules and principles.
We have been talking about now for a couple of years. Our group have been talking about the principle of democracy, and that gets to the equality question. And I'm just interested in your response to this. It strikes me that there may be no place in the country that has the agitation we're talking about so purely about equality as opposed to, say, anti-slavery, or even just simply women's rights. I mean, when we get to Thomas Mount Osborne, what's he doing? He's even including the lowest of low prisoners in terms of equality. But you can see it in Frances, you can see it in Martha, you can see it in Lizette. I mean, you know, this is a theme that's not universal.
Right, and you're saying it's peculiarly, specifically
Auburn.
Auburn, yeah, Central New
Or
York,
Cook
regional.
County, you know, Howland, we can't forget.
Howland, Emily Howland. People ask that all the time. What was it about this place?
Yeah,
I have a hard. I usually throw something in the water. I don't know. Seward does write. So he's born downstate. He's born in Florida, New York, in Orange County. His father was a slaveholder, and he wrote that he, for a time, believed that what he'd always been told, that slavery was a necessary evil for the growth of a young republic that had just cast off the shackles of the old world. It was precariously positioned for its independence, and he comes west along the Erie Canal in 1822, and he says the scales fell off his eyes. He sees so much of this region, Auburn, where he comes on Christmas Day 1822, he arrives, being built on free labor. Of course, that's not 100% absolutely true. We know John Hardenberg, our founder, brought slaves with him.
yeah.
But by and large, and New York is still a slave state in 1822, but by and large, he's seeing central and western New York being built up around free labor principles, which he will adopt, rejecting the inheritance of his father. And Frances is born into it. She doesn't have to. Change anything.
Yeah.
It's a natural way of living.
Do you think that, do you think it would be a fair statement, do you think of any place in the country where you have this sort of, I mean, it's not by any means Cuba County as a whole, but there is this, you know, you get this critical mass of these people who are, all of them talking equality, whereas the likes of Anthony and, you know, and
Gage or
Stanton are not. I mean, you know, there you have it, 1860, late 1860s to 1870s. You have, you know, these women backing away from the equality issue.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I don't know of any other place quite like it. I mean, I coming out of Rochester, I think Anthony and Douglas, but you bring up a really good point. If you're going to have a purity test, you can't do much better than Cuba County.
Well, it was feeding on itself. I don't necessarily mean purity, because, I mean, you know, as Martha said, you know, she wasn't very popular. Their position wasn't necessarily popular in this town.
That's true.
But these people were feeding on each other. I mean, now the money, that has something to do with the Osborne money, one of the largest manufacturing companies in the country here, and they were hell-bent on this idea of equality. You know, the setting up the housing, you know, for blacks that was a middle class, you know, as
Right.
far as we could tell at those points, no loss because of their color.
And you know who's doing that in the 1850s? William Seward's son, William Jr., who's a teenager about to turn 21, and who's really calling the shots, probably his mother, who's managing her father's old estate. And under the name William Seward and William Seward Jr., they're selling quarter-acre plots for $8, $10, $12 to working-class Irish and African-American families. The most famous example is $25 down for a 7-acre farm for Harriet Tubman. But in the 1850s, the Seward family is in the same business. And I'm really sorry to stop us, but I gotta pick up my son. We've been talking for a long time.
Let's ask just one more question. It's Christmas today, and we're at the Seward House, and we see the place beautifully set, and there's a setting for both Lucretia and Martha at the table. Could you just give us a minute or two on that. What that must have been like. What was the relationship that they would invite him to a Christmas event?
Yeah, it's easy to imagine the social scene. In fact, we don't have to imagine very far. It's not necessarily Lucretia or Martha, but you can imagine them. Frances preferred small settings. She would have been very happy if it was just Lucretia, Martha, maybe Elizabeth Cady Stanton, small number.
Mm-hmm.
Her husband, the thoroughgoing extrovert,
Oh,
the more the merrier. Let's pack the house. We can fit 25 around the dining room table and then more in the drawing room, spill over, and we'll have a big party. But in Elizabeth Cady Stanton's 80 Years and More, she recounts, it's not Christmas, but I think we can take some liberties, a dinner in which it's the crowded full table and it's William Seward and it's Frances and all of their friends, and they're doing what they do. They're talking and they're debating, and Seward was, famous for often playing devil's advocate in conversation and doing sort of opposition research and saying things he didn't believe to really press the arguments of allies and demonstrate sometimes empathy to adversaries that he wanted to win over. And so he and Stanton have this famous quarrel over whether women's equality was a desirable thing, whether the vote for women was a desirable thing. And he came out, no, and just came at it with everything he had. He loved to argue. He was a good lawyer before he was a good statesman. And when it was over, and everyone had gone to their corners and they were getting into the drinks or the fruits and desserts, he concedes that you've got the argument, but prejudice and superstition are against you, and it's gonna take a long time. And so they would have these kind of, I can imagine a Christmas, which they're trying to be nice, it's Christmas, they're wearing fancy things, the food is really good, they're excited for presents, but still having these kinds of conversations about stuff that mattered while getting excited for, Christmas. And interestingly enough, about 30 years later, when Stanton published her autobiography, 80 Years and More, she inscribed the note to the family that progress is the victory of a new idea over an old superstition. To bring it all back home.